Hello everyone. Can everybody hear me well? Okay, should I lean a bit? Hi, good evening and welcome to Researching for Social Justice. My name is Arequipa and I'm the coordinator of the Public Scholars Initiative, which is at the Graduate and Postdoctoral Studies at the University of British Columbia. I'd like to begin by acknowledging where we are. The ancestral, traditional, and unceded Aboriginal territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And we're always grateful for that. Today we're going to hear from an amazing lineup of speakers. They're all UBC doctoral students doing outstanding work that is not only scholarly rigorous, but also seeking to advance the public good. This is why our initiative is called Public Scholars, and the talk series is called PhDs Go Public, so a lot of public in there. The idea is that doctoral education can engage meaningfully with the public through various interactions and collaborations. This event marks the fourth of the PhDs Go Public research talk series in 2017. We've had one on education, one on the environment, culture and diversity, this one, and after this one on May 4th, we'll have the final one of this year on health and inclusion. So stay tuned for updates. Just a few notes before we get started. The event is being filmed and photographed. If any of you have a problem with that, please let our photographer Melinda or our videographer Mark know. Also, please help yourself to refreshments on this side, and then the washrooms are outside right across. Finally, we encourage you to take the conversation to Twitter using the UBC PSI hashtag, which is on your programs. And we may have a chance to refer to those later. So the Public Scholars Initiative was born less than 2 years ago with a view to reimagine the PhD experience in closer connection with communities, while at the same time preparing students for a diverse array of careers. And I've been lucky to be a part of this team that built it, along with Dean Susan Porter and the senior advisor to the Dean, Jenny Phelps, who's not with us tonight. But most importantly, it's the 80+ students who are in the program who've built the Public Scholars Initiative, and you'll hear from 7 of those tonight. To talk more about how the PSI began its journey, I'd like to invite Susan Porter to the podium.
Thanks very much, F.A. I'm sure a lot of you have heard me say this spiel before, but in case there are some that haven't, I would love to be able to just give you a small background on what the PSI is about. So Canada produces many thousands of PhDs each year, and unlike in past decades, most of them do not become professors at the end. They go out into other parts of society, in the private sector, in the public sector, and they do innovative, creative, very important work that involves what I would call scholarship in the broadest sense. They're using their minds, their knowledge, and their abilities to make a change in the world. So the PSI really is an experiment. Can we look at a PhD program not just to prepare for the professoriate, but to prepare for these diverse types of ways that our PhDs will work in the world and also in the academy? We believe that the university has a very important role in society, and we believe our PhD students and our graduates are important in that role. And so these students here today will be demonstrating their rigorous scholarship, their creative ideas, and their positive impact on the world. And we're so fortunate to have them here with us and share that with us. So thank you.
Thanks, Susan. And by the way, Globe and Mail interviewed Susan today. They're writing on the PSI and in general the PhD outcomes. So if you're interested, there'll be an article on that tomorrow. So before we begin the student talks, a big thank you goes to the UBC Irving K. Barber Learning Center for generously sponsoring the recording of this event, which will be available on their website as part of their educational webcast series. So, searching for social justice or researching for social justice, what does that even mean? And to begin with, what does social justice mean? So I looked it up. In most basic terms, social justice can be understood as a more fair, humane, and egalitarian distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges within a society. Would you agree with that? Anything to add? A more fair, humane, and egalitarian distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges in a society. And if you look at your event programs, you'll see 7 doctoral students whose disciplines are widely diverse. We have 2 anthropologists, a geographer, resource management student, mining engineering, forestry, and planning. And their topics range from First Nations issues in Canada to gentrified neighborhoods in the US, all the way to mining practices in Peru and forests in Bolivia. So what do these have in common? What I think ties all these talks together is the search for social justice. How can we enable a more fair distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges in different parts of the world? But this is not simple activism either, because it's also research for social justice. In other words, rigorous research done in collaboration with communities and various partners, various other segments of the public, being used as a tool for empowerment for marginalized groups. So in my mind, this will be the thread that links these diverse talks this evening. Finally, a word on the structure. We'll begin with 4 speakers, followed by a Q&A, and then we'll give a short break, more food and conversation, and then 3 more speakers, Q&A, and then we'll call it a night. So shall we begin? Legal documents are usually dry in language and seemingly boring. But what we often forget is that every piece of legislation, and especially the making of constitutions, has a dynamic social struggle behind it that involves different social groups. We begin tonight with one such story, namely the Constitution Express, a movement in the 1980s to assert Indigenous rights, nationhood, and self-determination during the patriation of Canada's Constitution. To tell this story, please welcome Emma Feltz from Anthropology.
All right. Thank you so much, F.A. It's really special to be able to present alongside such amazing scholars who are all doing rigorous academic work that advances social justice. So I'm really happy to be here and ready to go. So as F.A. mentioned, my project is about a movement called the Constitution Express. But I thought I might start by actually talking about the big birthday party Canada is throwing for itself this year. It's the 150th anniversary of Confederation, and as Canada gears up to celebrate, Indigenous people are making savvy interventions that expose the history of colonialism, like, for example, Cree artist Kent Monkman. In all of this, I've been thinking about ways that settler Canadians might reflect critically on our histories and the stories that give Canada meaning. And I've come to think of my project as another kind of intervention. One that recovers a different kind of resistant history about Canada and its relationship with Indigenous peoples. And I'm going to tell you just a bit of that story. So on November 24th, 1980, here in Vancouver, 2 trains were loaded up with flags, banners, drums, people and families, and left for Ottawa, destined to change the Constitution. This became known as the Constitution Express. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau had proposed to patriate the Constitution from the UK, to make it our own, and take a new step towards detaching ourselves from our colonial custodian. But this proposed patriated Constitution made no mention of Indigenous peoples, no hint of Canada's relationship or obligations to them. So people started to worry that their rights would be extinguished by omission, by simply not being there, that their standing as treaty partners, as people with land rights that predate European arrival would disappear, and that the political partnerships that made Confederation possible would be quietly erased. And without their consent, they'd be tossed in as another minority within multiculturalism. So the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, with Grand Chief George Manuel as their president, chartered 2 trains to Ottawa. One took the northern route and the other went south before they joined up in Winnipeg. And as they gathered people along the way, they did workshops in popular education on nationhood and jurisdiction. By the time they reached Ottawa, the trains carried 1,000 people and a powerful vision for self-determination. They held conference, potlatch, and protested on Parliament Hill, Here's George Manuel at the helm. And for patriation to happen, they argued, a tripartite agreement should be reached between Canada, Indigenous peoples, and the UK on the political jurisdiction each should have. And then they went international. They launched a second campaign, the Constitution Express 2, that went to New York, where they presented at the UN, to London, where they launched a case in the British courts, and then elsewhere in Europe, where they drummed up really broad, widespread support. And this was at a time when Indigenous peoples were only just starting to organize at the international level. The Constitution Express 2 really propelled what was then sort of a budding transnational movement and helped to lay groundwork for the major advancements that we see today, like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Here in Canada, the movement was vital in getting Section 35 added to the Constitution, which recognized the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. Given that it changed the Constitution, it's shocking how little this story is known, how little attention it's had from academics, but also the public. I've heard it called the most effective direct action in Canadian history, but 35 years later, it's still a missing piece of history. And I came to know this story directly from those who were involved over about 7 years working with members of the Heiltsuk Nation in interior BC as a researcher, polyanalyst, and ally, where the movement's leader, George Manuel, is from, and his family of activists such as Arthur Manuel, who you just saw. They encouraged me to research this story with some urgency, while some of its leaders are still alive to tell it. So really, this project, I think, was a public one before it was an academic one. The goal of my PhD is to document the movement and to draw public attention to it by collaborating on both academic and non-academic articles and even a documentary film. I'm working with living organizers of the movement to collect their oral histories and stories of it. And with support from the Public Scholars Initiative, I'm also able to facilitate group conversation circles with key organizations so that we can have more dynamic conversation about what went on. In all of this, I'll be guided by participants on how they'd like their stories represented. This is, after all, a story about Indigenous people's self-determination, so finding ways to honor that, honor their leadership in the research process itself, is my guiding methodology. But this project is not just about documenting an unrecorded story. It's also about the future. The relationship between settler Canada and Indigenous peoples remains unjust, and proposed solutions continue to fail. Why not look to the models that Indigenous peoples have been putting before us for more than 150 years? In movements like this one, the Constitution Express put forward a proposal, a political relationship based on mutual recognition and shared jurisdiction. And while Trudeau here celebrated the patriation with his famous pirouette, Indigenous peoples weren't so pleased. Their vision was not captured in Section 35. I often hear it called an empty box, leaving Indigenous peoples to negotiate for each right piece by piece, either in court, in modern treaties, or other negotiated agreements. As Millie Poplar, one of the key organizers of the movement, has said, we were fighting for nationhood, not Section 35. So my project is about exploring what it would mean, what it would look like if we were to take that vision as our content for Section 35 and see how that might guide us in building just political relations today. Recently, my mentor, Arthur Manuel, passed away. And I've been looking through old messages and things from him, and there was this one text message that I loved that made me laugh, where he just wrote, "Have a wonderful time decolonizing yourself." And I think he was teasing me, but on the other hand, I think he was also sort of serious. This is work that we all have to do, Indigenous peoples and settlers alike. So coming up on this 150th birthday party, this is what I've been thinking about. My goal for this project is to contribute to this growing, resistant, resurging alternative history of Canada, one in which Indigenous and non-Indigenous people might see ourselves reflected and also see paths forward. So with the guidance of movements like the Constitution Express, I think we might all have the wonderful experience of decolonizing ourselves. Thank you.
Well, just a note about the format. You might have noticed that each presenter has 20 seconds per 20 slides, a total of, 6 minutes and 40 seconds. And there's nothing, no clicker here. They have no control over it. They have to be very well prepared. It's moving on its own. It's not looking back. And now for something completely different. Any Monty Python fans? No? Okay, when you hear the word mining, what's the initial reaction that you have? So, somebody, yeah, well, overall negative. That's especially in BC and in Canada, I would say. We're particularly sensitive about mining, especially having seen extremely detrimental mining practices for communities and the environment. But does mining have to be like this? It's an interesting question. Is a socially and environmentally sustainable and responsible mining possible? Our next speaker will discuss the issue based on her case study in Peru. Please welcome Jocelyn Fraser from Mining Engineering.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for that introduction, F.A., and thanks, everybody, for coming out tonight. My first slide's actually not timed, so if you set it up, and then I'll ask you to advance. Yeah. So what I want to talk to you about this evening is this issue, the question, really, can mining foster sustainable development? It's a key issue and question in my research, and I have a professional interest in it, too, because I've worked as a CSR practitioner in the field for a number of years. But I think more importantly, I have a deep personal connection to it. My great-grandfather was an underground miner, and the money that he earned allowed him to send his 6 children, including the 4 girls, to university. That's my grandma on the right. She was a math whiz and spoke Latin. And this is her youngest sister, who went on to do a master's degree at Columbia University, and then went to work in Beirut before the war. But that was in the days when mining and communities were very closely linked. And that's not really the case anymore, because much of mining today is undertaken by global multinational companies that lack a close connection to the communities in which they operate. And as F.A. mentioned, mining today is mostly known for its negative impacts on people, on the environment, and on human rights. Now, this persists despite a vast array of tools, voluntary codes of conduct, and reporting protocols to help companies do a more responsible job, and the efforts on the part of at least some companies to act in a more accountable manner. So, when we start looking at mining, I wondered about this issue of mining community conflict, social risk, and social responsibility. And I discovered that this kind of conflict is increasing in countries all around the world. In Peru, where this picture was taken, but also in countries like Canada and Australia, where we wouldn't necessarily think they're high-risk jurisdictions. So the next part of the research was to look at what are the drivers of conflict? What's creating these situations? And I think it's fair to say the research suggests those causes are complex and interwoven. But I think it represents a dissatisfaction with the current model of resource extraction, one that's failed to deliver long-term sustainable benefits to communities that host mining operations. And conflict is costly. It's not just costly for companies, as this graphic shows, but it's also costly for communities that are losing out on opportunities to collaborate to address what we academics like to call the wicked problems or the grand challenges of sustainability. So what can or should mining companies do differently? Well, I think that there's a tremendous opportunity presented in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. There's no question mining has made a contribution to the problems that the SDGs, as we like to call them, seeks to address. But mining is also very well positioned to advance progress on the goals, especially number 6, access to clean water. Water is a frequent cause of mining community tension. Mines need water, often a lot of it, and we often operate in areas of water scarcity. But communities need water too, for essential things like life and their other industries. And where mining companies view water as a commodity, communities quite rightly view it as an essential human right. So I wondered if I could find a project where a mining company had taken a more collaborative or inclusive approach to addressing a water issue. And I found one in Peru. And so I had an opportunity to travel there to talk to water conservation people, to farmers, to people involved in small enterprise, social leaders, and a host of other stakeholders. So my research was in Arequipa, which is in the southwest of the country. The capital city is also called Arequipa, and it's home to about 1 million people. Now, it's also a region that's very important for agricultural exports, and it's a resource-rich region. Just about 30 kilometers outside of the city of Arequipa, high in the Atacama Desert, is the world's largest, 5th largest copper mine, Cerro Verde. And when mining engineers there began planning for a mine expansion, they knew that if they wanted to avoid the kind of conflict that had impacted other projects, they would need not to be in competition with farmers for clean water. So as they planned their project, they looked at the traditional ways that they might source water. But the solution to the problem didn't come from mining engineers, it came from social leaders, who said to the miners, couldn't you use your problem-solving skills and your technical expertise to address a critical social issue, wastewater treatment in the city of Arequipa? Now, at that time, the city was discharging about 95% of its sewage directly into the Rio Chile, which is the principal water source for the entire region. And despite the fact that fecal chloroform levels vastly exceeded safe standards set by the World Health Organization, agricultural land downstream was being irrigated using the water. So, following a period of consultation with a vast array of stakeholders and many interesting and, I suspect, some contentious meetings, it was decided that the company would build, manage, and operate a wastewater treatment plant for the city of Arequipa. And in exchange, they would get a portion of that treated water for use in their mining operations. So what we have today is the wastewater treatment plant that's circled over there on the right, and this graphic is provided by the Water Authority to illustrate what they call the virtuous circle of water. As I say, a portion of the water goes to the mine, but the remainder goes back to the Rio Chile, helping to rehabilitate the river, reduce fecal chloroform counts, and reduce waterborne illness, of agricultural outcomes. And these pictures show you the difference in the river after just 5 months of the wastewater treatment plant's operation. And in fact, just last month, for the first time in many years, trout were found in the river. Now, I think it's rare to find an example of a project like this where the benefits accrue equally to society and to the mine. But what my research tells us is that when businesses make decisions with sustainability at the core, they have the opportunity to improve social justice, to reduce social risk, and to deliver a really solid return on the investment. I think that there's a real opportunity with the Sustainable Development Goals, and what my research suggests is there's an opportunity for a new model of engagement, one that places the Sustainable Development Goals at the center of a conversation by stakeholders interested in pursuing collaborative solutions. There's no question, there's still far too many incidences of mine and community conflict, and there's still too many examples of companies that don't conduct themselves in a socially responsible manner. But what my research suggests is if mining companies were to reframe their approach to social responsibility to focus on the Sustainable Development Goals, we might end up with better business and a better world. Thank you.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Public scholarship requires you to be with the public. That's why 2 of our speakers tonight, they will not be joining us in person, but they did send videos from the places where they're doing their research. So one of them is in New Jersey. So from Peru, we now come back to North America. And he partners with labor communities in the US who are employed in last mile delivery. Anybody knows what that is? Last mile delivery? It's kind of exactly how it sounds. The distance between retailer warehouses and a consumer's home. Basically, when you order something from Amazon, the person who brings it to you, that's the last mile delivery. And there's so many significant labor issues revolving around that. To address these issues and improve working conditions in this sector, Kyle Lowen from Geography has recorded this talk for this evening.
Hello, my name is Kyle Lowen, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography at UBC. My dissertation investigates how the logistics industry and the organization of work in warehousing and delivery are restructuring in order to make e-commerce markets possible. To understand the significance of these processes, let me give a little bit of context. The movement of commodities from factories to consumers is transformed from a secondary to a primary concern for many companies. This transformation is significant because it shapes the ways companies make and invest profits, the regional dynamics of economic development, and the ways that firms value and employ a growing amount of labor. The shorthand term for this management of commodity movement is logistics, and it's been a side of restructuring for 30 plus years. As an example, Walmart revolutionized the ways that commodities got from factories to their retail stores in the 1990s. This gave them leverage to squeeze suppliers and push down the labor costs in factories in order to make goods cheaper in their stores. Now, Amazon has taken the lead in logistics innovation. However, its focus has shifted from the factory to the consumer. In more technical terms, this shift towards consumers is often referred to as the, quote, last mile of the supply chain. This idea of the last mile refers to the space between a retailer and a consumer's address. Walmart expected that consumers would undertake this unpaid labor and cost of going to a store, finding the items that they want to purchase, and transporting those items home. In contrast, Amazon and others have focused their efforts on finding new ways to deliver items from their warehouses to your doorstep. This current round of restructuring for e-commerce is the focus of my dissertation. I argue that this restructuring of last mile logistics is significant because it means that retailers are no longer just selling commodities. In addition to commodities, retailers now also sell the convenience of delivery and the time saved by not having to travel to a store to buy something like food. My research demonstrates that this production of surplus time for consumers only becomes possible through the reorganization and resegmentation of warehousing and delivery work. As part of this dissertation, my Public Scholars Initiative project involves collaboration with an immigrant worker center in New Jersey called New Labor. As a worker center, New Labor focuses their organizing efforts on the kinds of low-wage and temporary work traditionally ignored by unions who consider this work unorganizable. Our project is focused on documenting and sharing the stories of warehouse and delivery workers who make e-commerce possible. In New Jersey, many warehouse workers are undocumented and undocumented immigrants employed through temporary agencies. These folks make up a large portion of New Labor's membership and organizing base. We are documenting these workers' stories through both recorded interviews and journals that are written over a 2-week period. These efforts will culminate in a public exhibit that will be held in New Brunswick, New Jersey. But how does this project actually seek to advance social justice? Any project oriented towards social justice has an implicit or explicit theory of social change and transformation. A common tactic among academic and activist work on global production has been to expose the otherwise concealed working conditions of offshore factories in order to appeal to consumers' consciences. Consumers then become not only the audience of this research, but the means of social change through either organized boycotts or ethical purchasing practices. This is still an easy and enticing trope for my own research, which admittedly I've used in my public scholars bio. By imploring Amazon shoppers to consider how products get to their doorstep just so fast, it is easy to then describe the often breakneck work pace and precarious conditions that Amazon workers face on a day-to-day basis. In fact, many excellent journalists have already undertaken this task. But what if we flip the script a little bit? What if instead of making consumers both the audience of research and the implied subject of social change, workers themselves took up this role? There's a few ways that we're trying to do this in this project, though it's always incomplete and partial. First, the actual journaling process tries to create an opportunity for participants to reflect on and evaluate the terms and conditions of their employment. Through the journal prompts, workers are pushed to think about their workplace in different ways, and it is hoped that this will provide organizing opportunities for New Labor. Second, the participants in the project are being encouraged to also take part in the planning and holding of the exhibit. We hope that this process will be particularly generative, as participants will have to work through multiple and disparate stories that are in the recorded material in order to find their common themes and connections. Finally, The event itself is going to be held in New Brunswick, New Jersey, the neighborhood where New Labor organizes. This is in contrast to a venue catering to middle-class consumers. In this sense, the exhibit is oriented less towards, quote, revealing warehouse working conditions to unknown consumers and more towards building connections among workers and community residents. But how does this effort to facilitate collective organization amongst warehouse and delivery workers contribute to a broader idea of the public good? While this project attempts to build connections with and facilitate the organizing efforts of New Labor, these goals actively work against the interests of the logistics industry, which is represented by groups like New Jersey Staffing Alliance and the New Jersey Material Handling Society. In industry terms, collectively organized workers pose a, quote, risk to the smooth and seamless functioning of supply chains. Further, they have the potential to challenge the low wages and precarious employment relations that employers materially benefit from. This reality challenges how we should appeal to and use the idea of the public in our scholarship. Rather than appeal to a politically neutral concept of the public good in which there is no conflict between interests such as workers and employers, I would like to conclude by contending that all public scholarship must interrogate how the definition of the public is itself a political question that requires researchers to take political stances. Thank you.
Our final speaker before the break has literally entered dumpsters to rescue wasted food, witnessing the commercial wasting of food as well as its recovery. It's in her profile, I'm not making this up. She teams up with an activist group named Food Not Bombs to study commercial food waste in the face of hunger. She also works closely with donors and anti-hunger activists to find ways of getting food to people in need. Please welcome Sarah Fessenden from Anthropology.
Hello, and thank you all for being here. This is an exciting crowd and everyone that we get to talk with today. I'm excited to share with you some of my research, experience, and thoughts on food, hunger, and waste. Today I'll be discussing searching and researching for social justice with a focus on the potential of food activism in the midst of both hunger and an abundance of food waste. And I put these issues together because they go together. We're all aware of the prevalence of hunger in the midst of a wasteful food system where a perfectly good apple goes uneaten just because of some discoloration or slight bruising that's unappealing to many customers. And there's no shortage of charities to reclaim this rejected food and move it to people in need. While I'm interested in the long-term potential of more empowering alternatives to charitable giving, or at this intersection, what I'm interested in is this sort of long-term opportunities for more empowering alternatives to charitable giving, while in the short term finding ways to more effectively bring people otherwise wasted food. I just defended my dissertation at UBC. I'm in the Department of Anthropology. Now, this isn't the kind of anthropology that goes into, you already saw it, the sort of, Indiana Jones caves and sword fights. Instead, I just spend a lot of time with people like you just saw. One of our main methods is participant observation, and this is really what it means. Spending time with people doing everyday things like cooking and eating together. So my dissertation, We Just Want to Warm Some Bellies, Food Not Bombs, Anarchism, and Recycling Wasted Food for Protest, looks at the way that these activists recover, cook, and serve food to protest the distribution of resources to fund war, among other things, while people remain hungry. And while my dissertation started out as a project about food as an anarchistic protest object, it has applications beyond these sort of more theoretical interests. In other words, so I started researching, wanting to find out about how anarchist philosophy was translated into on-the-ground action. What do they do with their anarchist ideas? What do they critique, and how do they construct alternative systems? So while these questions formed my initial entry into this research, these kind of applied projects emerged. So this research looks at the potential of direct action projects outside of these protest moments. So if this group and others like it are creating new forms of social organization, what might their potential be? So after picking up donations of hundreds of pounds of produce and bread every week, in dumpsters sometimes, and refusing a lot more, I also started to look at the question of why food that businesses would like to donate still goes to waste. So the problems as I'm constructing them here are hunger and food waste. So the first problem is hunger. Food Banks Canada reports that 13% of Canadians are food insecure. And the UN report on the right to food in 2011 said that it's unacceptable in a country as prosperous as Canada that an estimated 2.5 million people are food insecure. And the second problem is wasted food. So in Canada, over 40% of food is wasted. And much of this is at the point of consumption, but there's also quite a bit at distribution, where wholesale distributors, marketers, and bakeries just throw food away. And these two problems are often blended together. So you have shelters, you have groups like Second Harvest in Toronto that pick up this food that would otherwise go to waste and take it to people in need. And while these efforts are useful, they're not quite enough. Charity can be disempowering, as many have argued. Jean Swanson says that charity creates a relationship of power and dependence instead of one of equality and respect. Charitable food even can be disempowering. I've certainly heard countless refrains of people being tired of the bologna sandwiches on white bread. And the second problem is that charities may even perpetuate hunger. Janet Poppendieck says that they can act as a moral safety valve. So people think that they're solving hunger by giving people food. But what we miss when we just feed people is the opportunity to ask the right question: what actually causes hunger? So what alternatives are there? We can think about food security as a way to bring people food and good enough food, or we can think about food sovereignty as a way for people to have some measure of control over their food. And my research comes in at this point, how food can be a right and not just a privilege. So it comes in at when we need to alleviate hunger in the present moment as kind of short-term emergency relief, and two, when we need to address chronic long-term hunger. So to address hunger in the short term, we need to find ways to more effectively bring the food from donors that want to donate food to people in need, but aren't really doing that as much. And at the same time, we need to change the fact that so many people remain hungry, addressing it in the long term. And so my research has brought me into contact with wholesale distributors like Terra Breads and This Bread, urban farms, other bakeries. And from these places, we've received hundreds of pounds of food and turned away so much more. So we need more effective ways to channel donations. And my current research is about getting to know some of these donors, so more than I've already gotten to know, and through interviews and questionnaires, finding what challenges they face. And then how do we get food to people in a more empowering way? Certainly food sovereignty should be the goal. And one way to do this is to invite those receiving the food into the process of cooking and serving it themselves. And of course, there's challenges. There's challenges in the research design, logistical challenges. In research, I found a disconnect between what donors say and what they actually do. Logistically, there are challenges to recovering food, so people that are managing the donations have primary responsibilities, for example, in marketing. And in implementing empowering alternatives, there are also some challenges. But these challenges are not insurmountable. Creating networks and increasing communications between donors and recipients, by allowing people and families, perhaps in a community partnership, to pick up food directly and cook it together would not only be more empowering, it would help the food go further and to feed more people. So let's find empowering alternatives to help people today in the midst of our current economic system, and look forward to the future, imagining creating systems where food will be actually a right and not a privilege. Thank you.
Food for thought. Now I would like you to turn to the person next to you and introduce yourself if you don't know them, and spend the next 1 minute or maybe 2 minutes coming up with a question to one of the speakers that you've just heard. And then we'll start the Q&A. I think we're ready for questions. I think we're ready for questions. So who'd like to go first?
Hi, we were just talking about your mining example, which is fabulous and great. But that's a very nice example of a community that needed something and the mine supply something that they need. So what happened to communities where they don't need anything from the mine? They have the rivers in Canada, they've got drinking water, they've got a nice environment, and they absolutely don't want the mine. What is the social responsibility of social license to operate in that case? And what are the possibilities?
So I'm asked to repeat the question. So we get the hardest question right off the bat, which is, so the question that this gentleman asked is, what about situations where communities are very nicely set up, thank you very much, and they really don't want mining, they don't need mining, they don't want it in their community. Is that fair? Yeah. Yeah, so this is a question that's really challenging, and I don't have an answer for it. What I would say is that if mining companies reframe their approach to social responsibility to look more closely for the points of intersection between what companies need but also what communities need, because even communities that are very well established often have some aspirational goals for their long-term sustainability. And mining companies have a couple of things that can be useful in facilitating that. They have the technical expertise of mining engineers who tend to be very pragmatic thinkers and good problem solvers and planners. They often have access to capital, which can be difficult for non-governmental organizations, and in these cash-strapped times are sometimes really hard for communities to come up with too. And they have a convening power, so they have a different set of stakeholders, especially stakeholder groups that run through their supplier value chain, which gives them points to tap into other areas of expertise that can sometimes bring something to the table. So I think it's about reframing the conversation and less about what mining can give to us or what do they pay for in order to have a right to be in our community, and more about a collaborative conversation around what does the sustainable future for this area look like and what role can each party around the table play in moving that agenda forward. Okay. Yeah?
Thank you very much for all the presentations. My question also goes to Jocelyn.
Oh dear.
I'm from Peru, so and also I'm a PSI public scholar, and I work in alliance with communities that have seen very closely all the impacts of extractive industry. So I was wondering, and actually would like to challenge your argument about the SDGs. I think we are pretty exposed about that those recommendations are not binding, and also at the same time seeing out of experience as Peruvian how the industry fights really hard to don't even comply with what is binding in the legislation of Peru. So understanding a little bit what I see in the ground, also what I see and what I read with other researchers like Joe Bacan that says that CSR, corporate responsibility, social corporate responsibility, is it was set up to kind of as a service to industry rather than to communities. So how to make a sustainability actually in practice where the structures don't allow that, but rather disempower communities?
Okay, that's a great question, and I have to repeat it in so that it appears on the recording. And I'll just as concisely as I can. So the question is really around mining companies don't have a great reputation for delivering on corporate social responsibility promises and commitments. And in countries like Peru, where there's been a lot of conflict around mining companies and communities, what's going to make a difference this time around, right? And if we're just talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, really, are mining companies going to be obligated to fulfill that commitment? Does that sort of summarize it?
Challenge the structures that are set up to service industry rather than community. So
Okay.
what in your project challenge actually the structures of legislation?
Okay, so this whole notion about compliance with legislation and the structures, and do we need a fundamental change maybe? And I think Peru is a super interesting country to look at. And my research actually looked at two competing projects in Peru, which I thought was fascinating. One is what a project that The Guardian described as the most contentious environmental issue in Peru, which is Southern Copper's project for Tia Maria, which you probably know of, right? Now that project happens in the very same jurisdiction as the Cerro Verde project. It's mining the same commodity. It's owned by an American company that's publicly listed, so it's got public shareholders. There's a lot of commonality there. One project came into production without losing any days to social opposition, and one project has remained mired in controversy since 2011. And worse, in the Tia Maria case, 8 people have lost their lives, and last year alone, more than 300 people went to the hospital as a result of community company disagreement. So a terrible situation. I'm going to go back to the Sustainable Development Goals because they're an aspirational agenda. But where I think there's a real opportunity for mining companies is when we reframe that approach to social responsibility. So moving beyond the traditional idea of philanthropy and community giving and maybe a little bit of doing well by doing good, optimizing performance or reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Those kinds of things aren't really moving the needle in terms of what communities are hoping for from mining companies. And I think more importantly, what communities deserve from mining companies. So what I'm really looking at in my research is this opportunity to move to a place that uses transformative CSR, really shared purpose, shared value. And 2 guys out of Harvard, Michael Porter and Mark Kramer, came up with this idea about co-creating shared economic value. And there's a place where I think there's a huge opportunity because when you find those points of intersection, you marry up a business need with a social need, you get a solid return on your business investment, which is going to motivate companies to be more responsible. But communities are partners and they also see the benefits. Now, it all sounds great to talk in a forum like this about how wonderful and easy it is. It won't be easy. And I looked long and hard for a research opportunity. And it was really because of Andre Xavier, who's here in the room with us tonight, who happened to come across Cerro Verde and some work that he's also doing in Peru, where we finally found a company that sort of provided a frame for a good story as opposed to the much more common stories of disagreement. So it's a long, hard road, and I'm sure your research more than shows that.
Other questions? We have constitution.
Please for someone else.
Hi. The Constitution Express is a thank you for introducing us to it, because that was new to me. And I'm wondering now, in light, 25 years after today, in light of the opportunity we have with retrospect, does nationhood in Indigenous communities maybe take a different definition to what it might have done in the initial effort? And the reason I bring in Michelet is I'm just thinking nationhood in a Quebec context,
right,
must inform some outcome around that.
Wow, that's a hard. Sorry. So to repeat the question. So I think the question is sort of post the Meech-Lake Accord. Does the way that they talk, does the meaning of nationhood change? Is that right? Yeah. So the way that the Constitution Express might have talked about nationhood versus today,
yeah,
and does it?
If you took Meech-Lake out of that completely,
yeah,
maybe some definitions would be shifting. But I'm also thinking that probably would accelerate some of the change.
Right. So. So to clarify, whether or not the discourse around the Meech-Lake Accord actually accelerated the concept of nationhood and even and sort of indigenous movements, the way they were using nationhood, like, yeah, I think. I mean, I think actually a lot of things have happened in the last 35 years, like since 1982. That may have changed the way that Indigenous peoples articulate nationhood, and also, of course, the way that Canada, like the Canadian state response, and settler Canadians as well. Specifically around the Meech-Lake Accord, I mean, what's something I haven't looked at, but what would be interesting is sort of where Quebec fits in the movement around constitutional patriation, and more specifically, I mean where Indigenous peoples from Quebec fit. So obviously, I mean, without getting too nerdy, like going into the history stuff, you know, that this happened like shortly after the James Bay Agreement, which was really the start of the modern treaty process. So nationhood was being used in different ways in different territories, and of course British Columbia didn't have that. It wasn't part of the treaty process at that time. So I think looking comparatively at different across the country is really important in terms of looking at how Indigenous movements articulate themselves in terms of nationhood and also self-determination. And especially in BC, I think even more than Meech Lake, I'd say, you know, the big Supreme Court cases are what have really accelerated the language around nationhood and self-determination. You know, of course, the Tsilcotin case and Delgamuukw and all the big ones regarding title here in British Columbia. So I think the discourse of nationhood has shifted and has accelerated, in your words, and so that's something I think that's really interesting to look at and to trace back through this history of the Constitution Express, right? Like to honor the movements that have come before that have really pushed Canada further. Did that?
Yeah. Time for one more.
One more for you. So in your research, it sounds like you've got a long history of working with the community that you've worked with. How have you tried to ensure that the community's interests and voice are captured in your research on an ongoing basis? And I guess as a follow-up question, do you and or the community consider your primary audience for your research to be like non-Indigenous Canadians, or more so their own people?
Mm-hmm. So the question is how to ensure that the communities I'm working with, their voices are sort of captured and sorry, what was the second part again? Also how the audience, so how I might envision the audience and how they do, and whether it's non-Indigenous people. So answering the second part first, I think, you know, for one thing, actually sort of answering both at once. I think that many stories can be told, like I hope to build a sort of momentum around the Constitution Express so that many different narratives of it can be told, not just, you know, the one that I'm producing, right? So, well, for me, I think an important audience is settler Canadians, is non-Indigenous people. But I think that there are many Indigenous people who have an investment in telling the story for other Indigenous peoples, right? And for documenting their history in that way, to share with among each other. And so I'm not looking to create, you know, like the story of the Constitution Express, but hopefully to instead like instigate or spark some energy around it so that more more stories might be able to come to the fore. And similarly, I mean, I think with the communities that I work with, I mean, what's challenging is that it's actually, you know, a national, to use the other way of using that word, a national project in terms of it involves everyone across Canada. And so it's hard because it means that there are many Indigenous communities involved. And the way I've been looking at it is I've really let the research content itself guide the methodology. I sort of hinted at that in the presentation, but if the Constitution Express put forward an idea, a model of respecting each other's self-determination, of having mutual recognition, having mutual jurisdiction, then that's the sort of way that I conduct my research as well, so that it's a partnership based on the political principles that were actually put forward in the movement.
So please join me in thanking the speakers. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a nice break. And our next speaker now, well, we're going to do the same thing. 3 more talks, and then more Q&A, and then we'll call it a night. So our next speaker argues that gentrification and natural disasters have a lot in common. They both displace communities, they cause loss of livelihood resources, as well as trauma for populations. He's going to explain it better than I am doing right now. He collaborates with urban community organizations in New Orleans to explore gentrification practices and seeks to increase the resilience of neighborhoods in the face of, sorry, I lost my track.
I'm going to do the same thing in 2 minutes.
Okay. Again, he's working with urban community organizations in New Orleans to explore gentrification practices and seeks to increase the resilience of neighborhoods in the face of catastrophic change. That was easy. Please welcome Jeremy Stone from Planning.
Thanks, everyone. Before you start, I just want to say 2 things. Number 1 is that I am terrible at PechaKucha format, so I'm gonna read the whole time. If you find this distracting, feel free to close your eyes and pretend you're listening to a TED Talk in a blackout. It'll be just the same. And then the second thing, on a more serious note, in addition to the territorial acknowledgement that we're on unceded territory, I also want to make a positionality acknowledgement, and just to say that I am clearly a large white male, and yet I work with primarily African Americans in New Orleans, and so I just want to say that whatever I say today is mostly my interpretation of the data and findings, and I, by no means speak on behalf of them, the community partners and whatnot. I'm really speaking on behalf of myself. So hit it. Okay. All right. My name is Jeremy Stone. I'm a PhD candidate in urban planning at UBC. My research looks at the intersection of gentrification and disaster, both by framing gentrification as a disaster that threatens low-income communities, but also as a product of disaster and our failure to plan for socially just disaster recoveries. Our theme today is social justice, and as an activist, to me, this has meant challenging or smashing the state. But as a public scholar, I realize that the public good is usually best served when existing systems are used or enhanced. So an essential tension in my work has been balancing being good and being smashy. The way I've addressed this is by taking a constituent-based approach, and yeah, that's me. Focusing my outcomes on what my partners in the community have articulated they might want or need. However, there's an ethical murkiness here if my dissertation is the center of that same project. So to be socially just, I've had to develop a socially just research design that is led by the community. So my talk today will focus on the evolution of my research, how it has been developed with and is responsive to the community I work in, and how I'm connecting it to larger scales of action, or how we're connecting it to larger scales of action. My research itself takes place in the central city neighborhood of New Orleans, which is historically African American and has faced a variety of economic and social challenges. During Hurricane Katrina, the neighborhood actually only got minimal flood damage, but many properties were abandoned by evacuees who could not afford to return. These properties in turn were seized by the New Orleans Redevelopment Authority and have slowly been returned to commerce through auctions to the highest bidder. This has contributed to gentrification in 3 ways. One is that the higher ground and central location is considered safer by new residents, so there are increasing demand pressures on the real estate market. Another is that the lack of a plan by NORA, the Redevelopment Authority, to protect neighborhoods for traditional residents have left them vulnerable to demographic change. And finally, the process of auctioning itself has actually buoyed housing values, which has driven up rents and property taxes. In addition to the loss of housing, the neighborhood has experienced considerable retail and cultural gentrification. Low-income serving businesses have been replaced by high-end restaurants, and the bars and social spaces that supported cultural institutions like Mardi Gras Indians and second-line bands are being lost. So how have I tried to develop a socially just research design? The first thing I did was pound the pavement in the neighborhood and visit every nonprofit or community organization saying, hey, there seems to be a problem with gentrification here. How can I offer my services as a pro bono consultant? Eventually, Harmony Neighborhood Development, a local public housing provider, took me on and asked me to do a qualitative study of how gentrification is impacting residents. They then introduced me to Lakedra, a community liaison who works deep in the community and knows everyone. She and I worked out a plan which included working on the questions and issues she wanted to learn about as well. In the meantime, we visited city government officials and housing advocates to find out what kind of data would be useful for them in developing policies and action. We then performed 60 interviews with a range of stakeholders, including traditional residents, new gentrifying residents, business owners, nonprofit staff, culture bearers, city staff, and others. Some of these people we reached out to specifically, while others we met on the street or were referred to by others. Although we have far too many findings to discuss here, a few key ones are worth mentioning. The first is that traditional residents don't always see or understand gentrification. New Orleanians see their neighborhoods as the very blocks that they live on, and they don't always feel concerned if changes are happening 2 or 3 blocks away. Similarly, many changes are seen as inevitable and something that residents are powerless to stop. So we've come to find that educating the community on gentrification is critical. The second is that really the leading edge of gentrification is prison, with thousands of young men and their incomes being sucked out of the neighborhood every year. If we're going to be serious about curbing gentrification, we have to focus more on criminal justice reform and reentry programming that keeps communities whole. Third, we have to take back control of the market somehow. There are various schemes including cash for houses, Airbnb whole house rentals, quiet title evictions, manipulation of Section 8 laws, and others that enable the ongoing dispossession of housing from low-income African American residents. This requires a mix of policy interventions and education to preserve housing. Finally, almost all of our respondents have decried the loss of cultural and economic opportunities due to gentrification. Primarily white, middle-class in-movers refuse to participate in neighborhood events and rituals. They call the police on parades, musicians, and street vendors, and they treat older cultural spaces as blight and try to get them shut down. Clearly, there needs to be better understanding and support. So returning to our constituency model, what are we doing with all this data? The first is community organizing. We're working with Harmony and other partners to hold community meetings and rallies to educate the community about gentrification while empowering them as a voting bloc. We're also disseminating the data to area nonprofits to use in advocacy and fundraising. The second thing is engaging institutions. Rather than releasing a final study through Harmony itself, we're instead giving the study to one of the local foundations to release as their own publication. They're much more powerful than us, they can command media attention, and they can invest in policy programming on the back end. This is a strategic move to amplify our impact. As a part of this, we're also working with the city's Alliance of Housing Providers as a co-sponsor so that our study supports their recommendations for affordable housing. This is critical because we intend to release the study during the final 3 months of this year's mayoral and city council elections. Between the Foundation and the Housing Alliance, we intend to make this a policy issue that candidates have to respond to. Only after all of these actions have been taken will the dissertation become relevant or meaningful. At that point, I can wax lyrical about recovery justice and how gentrification threatens the daily life processes of low-income communities. Getting published in journals and books will advance that cause, and it is important. But it's really a secondary concern behind our work in Central City. So how do we advance social justice as scholars? I think we have to put people at the center of our work. I have what I call my brain trust, a group of people who are engaged, committed, and can guide me where the work should go. They define what the public good actually is, but they also use my skills and expertise in ways that best create the best outcomes for their community. I also believe that we should push the idea of grounded theory or research findings driven by what we learn on the ground more towards a concept of grounded outcomes. What I mean by this is that we can create more salient social change when we let our community show us what the dissertation should become, rather than us trying to fit their experiences into our experimental models. If as thought leaders we don't centrally benefit and represent the public we serve, then we have missed the purpose and opportunity of our role in society. Thanks.
How was it a bad Pechacucha? I don't really see it. Our next speaker will also be joining us through video. A very interesting fellow. He's originally from Nigeria. He's studying in Canada. He's in the forests of Bolivia right now, working with the indigenous communities over there while learning Spanish. So I thought my life was exciting. The story he'll be sharing with us is about Bolivia's Joint Mitigation and Adaptation Mechanism. It's a lot of words. JMAM. He's going to be saying JMAM a lot in the video. This is basically an initiative by the Bolivian government to reduce deforestation and forest degradation, while also reducing vulnerability of forest ecosystems and forest-dependent people. He collaborates with Natura Foundation Bolivia to explore indigenous-driven environmental politics there in the context of the JMAM. So please welcome the video of Yemi Adeye from Forestry.
Hi everyone, my name is Yemi Adeye. I'm a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Forestry. So this is a short story about two environmental schemes in Bolivia. GMAM, which stands for the Joint Mitigation and Adaptation Mechanism, and RWA, which stands for the Reciprocal Watershed Agreement. I will briefly highlight what they are, the similarities and differences, and more importantly, what we can learn that helps advance the way we plan and implement environmental initiatives. As we think about what social and environmental justice means for the marginalized. So GMAM has the primary goals of implementing locally driven interventions for forest conservation and to strengthen local capacity to meet livelihoods objectives. GMAM is a Bolivian government-led scheme which started off as a replacement for another, which is UN-led. The Bolivian government argued that the UN-led scheme encourages the treatment of nature as a commodity which can be bought and sold, and that this way of thinking undermines human-nature relationship that indigenous people of Bolivia uphold. So through Evo Morales' declaration at the UN Climate Change Convention in 2010, Bolivia pulled out of the UN scheme, and that is when the GMAM story began. So to fast forward a bit, implementing GMAM has not actually played out as the government proposed, and present challenges include instability in the government system, which directly impact GMAM. So it appears that the prospect of GMAM is tied to the prevailing politics of the country. And news has it that the personnel who were responsible for leading an agency which is supposed to guide its implementation have been sporadically changed almost annually since 2013 when the program was supposed to commence. So there is no consistent information about what the program is in terms of what is going on and what is happening, if there is anything at all. So overall, from my present understanding, which is yet to be guided by an extensive empirical finding, it appears that the scheme is politically motivated, ideologically driven, but presently not so technically sound. And that takes me to the second part of the story. RWA is a conservation model that responds to both conservation and livelihoods needs of the communities who have to deal with reconciling conflicting objectives of watershed utilization. A simple illustration of how RWA works is that upstream farmers are economically compelled to deforest their land for agriculture, in so doing exposing the upstream water to pollution as livestock then have unrestricted access to forage, drink and urinate at the watersheds. On the other hand, the downstream inhabitants are now provided with a steady flow of contaminated water. So for both upstream and downstream communities, everyone loses. So the RWA operates on two basic principles, and the first is protecting upstream forest will help maintain water supply in both quantity and quality. And the second is that downstream water users need to contribute to such forest protection. So it's like the old school tree by barter system. An example of such exchange in that is that a community downstream provides an upstream community with beehives and training on how to produce and sell honey in exchange for conserving an agreed forest area. So the interesting innovation here is that the downstream water users are the one paying for the scheme with little support from external sources. So the commonalities between these two schemes include a common target of achieving the twin goal of conservation and livelihood sustenance. They both engage diverse actors at the local, national, and international level, and they both have the fundamental premise of empowering indigenous communities to drive the agenda and play active role in the institutions that mediate the activities under the programs. However, independent reviews of these two concepts have shown more concern for the ability of GMAM to achieve its goal, while RWA appears to be seen as more promising. A review report that the RWA has positive impact on forest and water conservation by building local institutions and influencing human behavior. So in so doing, communities engage in new environmental practices because the RWA schemes build on existing environmental motivations and facilitate communities to make changes which they are already motivated to make themselves. So I should clarify that the purpose of this presentation is not to compare these two schemes, but to highlight how different approaches have far-reaching consequences on achievements. The RWA story brings to light a somewhat hidden approach to water conservation and management with local actors at the wheel. The disparity between these two stories help to emphasize the practicality of theoretical positions that local actors can be successfully empowered to drive interventions. And not just that, even when the interventions we are talking about involves the participation of actors at different levels, at the local, national, and international level. Indeed, it is complex and it's difficult but possible, as these two schemes rightly portray. So the RW is not a perfect scheme, but my research so far shows that it holds lessons for other environmental and conservation initiatives like GLAM. It provides lessons on how to transfer decision-making power from administrative and political centers to local actors, those who are better able to serve the good of themselves. While I continually try to deconstruct the mysteries of the GLAM scheme, in conjunction with Natura Foundation, we are planning to organize some public forums with the communities implementing RWA with the purpose of capturing these lessons that could potentially inform GLAM and other schemes like it. So thank you very much for sharing my story, and I hope that next time I'm available in person and I have a more exciting story to tell. Muchas gracias. Yeah.
We started out tonight with the story of the Constitution Express, traveled a bit around the world, and now we make full circle to end on another Canadian and Indigenous story. Our final speaker collaborates with the Heiltsuk Nation in Bella Bella, BC, to investigate the implementation of a large-scale land use agreement between the coastal First Nations and the BC government, as well as the implications of the agreement for the Indigenous well-being, and governance. Please welcome Maggie Low from Resources, Environment and Sustainability.
So hi everyone, thanks for being here tonight. My name is Maggie Low, and I would like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam people, and I am very grateful to be a guest on this land. And I'm a member of Wikamakong First Nation on Manitoulin Island in Northern Ontario. So tonight, I'm going to talk about the important relationship that exists between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. And my research explores this relationship through governance, specifically how new protocol agreements negotiated between several First Nations governments in BC and the province between them and the BC government are changing this relationship in important ways. And we've certainly been hearing more about reconciliation and rebuilding a new relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in recent years, especially with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which conducted a 6-year investigation of the atrocities of the residential school system, and just last year released their 91 calls to action to advance reconciliation. And as we saw with Emma's work, Indigenous peoples across the country have never stopped fighting for their Aboriginal rights, title, and interests, including land rights. Since the 1970s, the Supreme Court of Canada has consistently ruled in favor of First Nations seeking to exercise their rights over the land they claim as their territory. Yet battles over land rights persist. We've seen this very recently through recent protests of the Dakota Access Pipeline in the United States. And here in BC, there's a history of intense conflict over logging, mining, and recently over pipelines, such as the approval of the Kinder Morgan pipeline, which has been met with fierce opposition from several First Nations. So much conflict exists over land and water. Who has jurisdiction over it? How is it used? Who benefits from it? And who cares for it? And these questions are particularly complex in BC, as there are very few historic treaties that have been signed between the BC government and First Nations. But within the last 10 years, legally binding protocol agreements have been negotiated and signed between the BC government and several coastal First Nations governments as an attempt to address these conflicts over land. And my work focuses on the governance implications of one such agreement called the Reconciliation Protocol Agreement, signed between Heiltsuk Nation and the BC government in 2010. So Heiltsuk Nation's territory encompasses over 16,000 square kilometers of land and waterways on BC's central coast. Bella Bella, pictured here, is Heiltsuk's main reserve, which is only accessible by boat or air. and the Heiltsuk have never surrendered their rights to their territory, nor their duty to look after it. The Heiltsuk Integrated Resource Management Department is the government department responsible for stewardship in Heiltsuk territory. So 2 years ago, I approached the department to ask if they had any research questions that they needed answered. And they responded by asking me to investigate how the Reconciliation Protocol Agreement that they signed in 2010 had impacted their governance and benefited their community. So I set out to do this research by living in Bella Bella for just over a year. I conducted interviews with staff, elected leaders, as well as interviewed resource managers from other nations on the coast. I also attended several community events, meetings, and ceremonies, and was lucky enough to get out on the land and water quite often. So this 28-page protocol agreement is vast in scope, but pertains mainly to shared land use decision-making in Heiltsuk territory, and commits both parties to work more collaboratively together. It also focuses on advancing economic opportunities for the community through tourism, forestry, and clean energy initiatives. So through this agreement, Heiltsuk have increased the amount of timber available for them to harvest, and also agreed to a new and hopefully more effective consultation process with the province called the Engagement Framework. Heiltsuk have also used this agreement to create better working relationships with the major forestry companies operating in their territory. So overall, the Reconciliation Protocol Agreement has been an effective political tool Heiltsuk have used in ways that gives them a stronger voice in decisions being made about their lands. It has also played a role in getting Heiltsuk to the negotiating table with the BC government and now the federal government. In the words of an elected leader, I think being able to move from always a position of being outside or not at the table to having a voice at that table for things rightly that are happening within our territory. We ought to have the strongest voices around those issues. So being able to have this type of agreement sets that table for government-to-government discussions and not being on the outside looking in. So Heiltsuk are strategically using the Reconciliation Protocol Agreement to force the BC government and resource users to address their rights and interests in a more meaningful way. But of course, challenges still persist. And I am careful not to glorify the Reconciliation Protocol Agreement, as it is certainly not the only way Heiltsuk exercise authority over their lands. Importantly, Heiltsuk have maintained their hereditary governance system and have been asserting rights over their territory since time immemorial through their hereditary laws, which they call Gwilas. Heiltsuk have developed their own land use plan in which their hereditary laws are used to lay out a vision for how they will protect their resources for their survival and well-being. And Heiltsuk often use their land use plan when they are in discussions with both forest companies and the BC government. Heiltsuk have also negotiated several other types of agreements, including a reconciliation agreement with the Government of Canada, which is part of their much larger Heiltsuk title and rights strategy. So what is happening in Heiltsuk territory speaks more broadly to how First Nations in BC continue to assert authority with their own governance systems and sovereignty as their own level of government. And this growing authority should certainly not go ignored by the Crown or the rest of Canada as we move forward in this new era of relationship building and reconciliation. And while protocol agreements are not necessarily workable for all nations in BC, in recent years more protocol agreements have been signed, and I expect this will continue well into the future. And perhaps protocol agreements will provide helpful lessons as to what or what not establishing a mutually respectful relationship between First Nations governments and the Crown might entail moving forward. So I did want to acknowledge all the important folks that have helped me with my work and the funding I have received through SSHRC, UBC, PSI, and the Wikwemikong Board of Education. And of course, being a public scholar has provided me with valuable research support and connected me to so many inspiring folks like the one sitting here today. And I truly think their research will help make the world a better place. Thank you very much.
Well, let's do the same. So turn to the person next to you, take a minute or two, and then the Q&A will begin. Okay, let's get started. So, who would like to go first?
My question's for Jeremy.
Okay.
So, you said among the groups of people you spoke with were gentrifiers themselves, and I was just wondering if they self-identified in that way, or if you applied some criteria to them that made you consider them gentrifiers versus new residents or some other
I
way.
basically looked for white people. Sorry, I should re-ask the question. The question was there a rubric applied to defining gentrifiers, or did they self-identify? And yeah, I mean, we mostly looked around and asked, people who were white in the neighborhood, like, do you live here? How long have you lived here? Things like that. And almost to the person, I mean, we would ask every single person, do you consider yourself a gentrifier? And almost to a person, they would say yes. And what's really interesting, I find, is that I've seen over the past 5 years a real cultural shift in both Canada and the U.S. that people have become much more savvy about gentrification. It's much more in the media. People understand it more, and yet I also think that they're developing a lot more complex mechanisms of absolving themselves of the impacts of gentrification while still grabbing the moniker and owning up to it. But in one case, I worked with a place that I would consider a gentrifying sort of business home thing in the neighborhood, and I asked if I could come and present my research, and then they invited a lot of people in from their network. And so it was very clear that they were new residents, that it was all above board. It wasn't like, haha, are you a gentrifier, and then catching them in their dirty deeds, and what I found was, and what I find in this work across the board is just how complicated all of these things are, because I mean, honestly, in Vancouver, very much so, and also New Orleans, people who are gentrifying low-income neighborhoods are generally being pushed out of other neighborhoods. So, how do we, in a public policy environment, deal with the fact that these people are also dealing with their own pressures and complexities and issues? In many ways, I think that the answer to gentrification is not just affordable housing in low-income neighborhoods, but also in upper-income neighborhoods, so that people stay and don't necessarily get pushed in these areas. Sorry, I could talk forever.
How have the communities in which you both worked responded to your research? Like, have they been open to it? Have they been like, why are you doing this? Have they been like, yay, thank you for doing this? What are the responses that you've been getting from the communities being like, this is for both of you?
That's a good question. So the question was, what have the responses from the community been to our research? And so my research actually comes from a community-driven question. So I approached the Heiltsuk Integrated Resource Management Department, and because I had ties, or loved Bella Bella, had ties to the community, and knew I wanted to do work in the governance resource realm, but wanted to make sure that the work I was doing with an Indigenous community was going to be helpful. So I just asked them what would be helpful, and they came back to me. I gave the general specifications as I'm around, governance, political science kind of thing. I wish I studied Wales, but I don't. And they came back to me with this great question, and so I took it from there, and so that's given me a bit more confidence in that the research that I'm doing hopefully will be helpful or relevant. And I've tried to stay connected to the folks that ask me to do the research as much as I can, and as part of like I will be preparing a report for the community, and will probably be asked to present on it, which I'm more than happy to do. And then it's also going to be part of my dissertation as well, like a chapter of my dissertation.
I think just similar to Maggie, this comes from the community, and I've worked really closely with partners on the ground to make this more of their study than mine. Oftentimes I'm the only one pushing it, because I'm the only one who has the urgency really to do it, but I still have tried my best to make it something that's theirs, and that all the deliverables go back to them and whatnot. I think in terms of the people that we're interviewing, I have to put everything into racial terms, not only because in the United States is race such a higher profile issue than I find in Canada. Even though it is a high profile issue here, it's just even much more so there. And especially in New Orleans, it's even more so. It is interesting being a white person going into an African American neighborhood and asking them about, what do you think about all the white people in the neighborhood, and I use that as a specific question because a lot of times if you use the word gentrification, people are uncomfortable with it. They might not know what it is. It automatically creates a distance between you and them if you're using, like 25-cent college words rather than just speaking plainly. But I find if I say, so what do you think about all the white people moving in? They automatically have an experience with that, and they can speak to it very eloquently. And I think what's been nice, I think, is that they haven't had any problems being very critical about white people, even though I'm white, So certainly some people are like, no, it's all good, and then, and then my study partner Lakidra will be like, no, for real, like he's okay, and then they'll be like, okay, well, really, like white people are intense, But overall, like some of the quotes, like some of the just rich quotes that I've gotten out of this work is, like someone saying like too many white people on a block kills a block. And they have really good reasons why, there's just a culture amongst their community of how life goes every day. And then when you have a lot of outsiders come in, it just kills that culture. And the way that these folks are describing it is very emotional and also clear where policies and interventions and technical assistance can really make a difference. So I've been very blessed, I think, or lucky to have the people we're interviewing being very positive and engaged.
My question is also for Jeremy.
Sorry.
About New Orleans. You mentioned a lot your work with community organizations and their interest in your research. I would be interested in, was there also some, general interest by the official side, by the city council, for example, by city councilors?
No, I mean,
in your research, are they interested in this question? And did you reach out to them? Did these community organizations reach out?
Oh, look, man.
Or was it more like confrontational?
No, I mean, it's the same thing as in Vancouver, right? Like gentrification is big. I mean, it's big in almost every city in North America in some way or another. But I definitely in New Orleans, it's also a very hot topic. So we're going into an electoral season. One of the first things that I did, like Lakidra and I did, was we went to the city council members that we knew were sensitive to these topics, and also they have a ward system. It's not at large there. So there were, neighborhoods that were in their wards were being affected by gentrification. So we were able to go to them and say, hey, look, we're doing this thing. Are you interested? A, and B, if you are, what kind of data would you want? What do you want to know that will help you make policy or help you make this an issue? And so they were very responsive. They were like, okay, well, if you're going to do all the work, we'd like to know this and this. And then furthermore, one city council member said, her staff said, look, if you want to bring this to us, great, bring the data, but what would help us even more is if you bring model legislation and really bring us the things that we can bring into the council chambers and push. And so then they hooked us up with the Fair Housing Action Alliance Network Coalition, I don't know, but so Geheifak, I think, and they said, yes, we're going to help you with that, because that's what they do, is they write policy, they focus on these issues. So I mean, it's been just great going to each of these constituents, because also the foundations that we've gone to, they care very much about social justice, about resilience justice, and things like that, and they've been waiting for an entry point into the gentrification discussion. So, I called one funder who I know, and I just said, hey, I would like to give you the study, and have you guys release it. What do you think? And she was like, I have no idea, because I've never had anybody come to me and say, hey, here's this cool study and you can have it. Like, you don't even have to pay for it. And so, it's kind of messing with their heads, but they're into it. So, yeah.
Final question as for Maggie.
Yeah, please.
No, no offense, Jen.
No, but please.
Okay.
I have a question for you. I can't see you, I'm sorry, I'm short. Hi. So my understanding is that there's some controversy or tension between different communities, because some nations and some leaders feel that protocol agreements are being really negotiated from a place of weakness, and self-governance really needs to be identified and respected first from the Canadian government before agreements can really be brokered from a place of equality. So I was just wondering sort of if those tensions were still present in Bella Bella, if you saw any of that, and sort of as a part B to that question, if you saw any examples of where maybe the protocol agreement didn't turn out as well for the community as they thought it might.
Excellent questions. Heavy hitting. So, sorry, the question was, are there just controversy over negotiating these types of agreements between nations, other nations, and maybe what are some of the not so great things about what the reconciliation protocol has done? So, it's hard for me to answer those, really, because it's not really up to me to decide whether it's good or bad for each community. They've definitely, I think, been a very good tool, or some communities want to go that way, that kind of the negotiation route. There's kind of a hard line. There's the negotiation route, and then there's kind of more the title case litigation route. Not to say that those two things can't happen at the same time, because they can. But and in a lot of ways they are. So yeah, it's hard. Definitely there are nations that seem to be, Heiltsuk is one, that seem to be wanting to push the negotiation route, and it seems to be working for them in a lot of ways. And then there are others that don't want to go that way. So yeah, that tension totally exists, and you have to remember the context within each community and within each nation, and all of the nations are very different. So yeah, but really good question. And then in terms of the kind of not so great things about the RPA, I mean, I think one of the biggest thing is just broadly speaking that it has done a lot for, at least for the Heiltsuk that I know, at the kind of higher negotiation level. So there's been a lot of governance gains through it. It's given them a stronger voice, it's gotten them in the room. But in terms of kind of community members kind of feeling the benefits of it, or even really maybe even knowing what it is, it's that there's a challenge there that still remains. So in fact, really the biggest thing is trying to get the tangible benefits of it to the community members. It's still a challenge. Yeah.
Let's thank the speakers. Thank you all for coming. And if you like this format, if you enjoy the talks, we'll be doing one more of this. It's going to be on health and inclusion and policies and issues related to health on May 4th, and I'll be following up with email. But before you go, I'll pass it over to Susan to share the final remarks. Thank you very much for coming.
What a fabulous evening. Thank you so much to all the speakers. They were just so inspiring and interesting, and so proud that they're associated with UBC. When I was thinking about there was a lot of threads that connected this evening's speakers, and one of the first things that came to my mind was each individual was so passionate about what they do and about the individuals that they're doing the research for. It's not just knowledge for knowledge's sake, although that's a good thing, but these were so heartfelt desires to improve the lives of people. And so I thought it's a lovely combination of mind and heart. And I thought, well, that's also a good way of thinking about public scholarship in general. And I tried to look up, I should know it off by heart, but I wanted to get the definition of public scholarship. And I came across this one, which is very inspiring. They're talking about an organization that does public scholarship, but it also describes public scholarship. It creates spaces where hearts and spirits meet minds for deep, impactful, and sustained knowledge-making and healing. And I think that was representative of everyone tonight. As I mentioned, I think there was a strong sense that everyone was working for the betterment of the public. There was also a strong sense throughout each one that there was, they truly represented public scholarship, which is by definition mutually beneficial. It's a partnership. And I heard all kinds of things like reciprocity, co-creating, partnerships, mutual recognition, and it really was a true partnership, and that was inspiring. The other thing that I felt kept coming up was the idea of reframing. I think Jocelyn first mentioned it, but I realized it was almost, I think in every single talk, there's where the mind comes in, and it's what academics do. They reframe things. They think about things differently. They articulate things differently. They put it in a different context, and that can be extraordinarily helpful. So we talked about reframing history with Emma. We talked about reframing approach to business with Jocelyn. We talked about reframing labor and the public and scholarship for Kyle. Sarah talked about reframing food and hunger and surplus versus scarcity. Jeremy talked about reframing gentrification as disaster. Yemi talked about reframing environmental intervention. And Maggie, in a sense, talked about reframing government and First Nations relationships. And we are so, I feel so proud that these people are working, that these students are working on so hard on these projects and so creatively and using their full capacities of mind and heart. So thanks so much.